fundamentally, what's causing type 2 diabetes to occur, which is the elevated blood glucose, is that there are problems with insulin receptors on cells where they become less responsive. And it's a spectrum, right? You can have, maybe they're 90% responsive compared to completely healthy. Maybe they're 80, 50, 30, and it just keeps getting worse and worse. And when insulin isn't able to bind to these receptors effectively and transmit the signal telling the cell to take up glucose from the bloodstream, then your blood glucose starts to rise or stay elevated after eating.
Alex, welcome back.
Yes, I'm happy to be back, man.
So I think this has got to be number 7 or so at this point, maybe number 8. For those that don't know, hopefully you've listened to some previous podcasts where Alex has been on the show. But Alex is someone who works very closely with me on all of our writing projects, on program development. He's the co-developer of and I would say actually the main developer of the Fat Loss Blueprint program, the Advanced Fat Loss Strategies program that we co-developed together a year or two ago, something along those lines. And this is really a no frills, no gimmicks, no BS, no fad diets, no crazy wacky promises of 30 pounds of weight loss in 4 weeks and whatever kind of other BS that's out there. This is really just a collection of the most rock solid advanced fat loss strategies according to the scientific evidence circa 2023, 2024. And it's a phenomenal program. I'd highly recommend everybody check it out. It's available right now in honor of this 2-part podcast that we are doing right now with Alex. We're putting it on sale for $200 off the normal price, so you can get it for $297 instead of $497. There'll be a link below, or you can go to theenergyblueprint.com and go to programs and get it there. And that offer will just be available for the next week. So check that out if you're interested in fat loss. Alex is also a co-author on my most recent book, Eat for Energy. And in general, and in terms of formal credentials, he's got a master's degree in nutrition. He's one of the most well-read. He's got a very special brain. So he just holds on to scientific studies in his mind, and they're just locked in for years. I don't know, maybe you'd call this a photographic memory, but it's something along those lines where he stores information in his brain better than 99.99999% of people. And so he has become just world class in terms of nutrition knowledge, in terms of understanding many aspects of physiology. And I value him tremendously, and I'm very grateful for him as a co-author and co-developer of my books and programs. And he's just been a joy to work with for the last 5 or 6 years. And I have enormous respect for his expertise, and which is why he's here yet again on the podcast to deliver some of that expertise to all of you. So what I wanted to chat with him today about is one of his areas of expertise, which is understanding the science around insulin resistance and diabetes. And a lot of this discussion is really at the center of so much of the modern disease epidemics, the diseases, what are called sometimes the diseases of civilization, or the diseases of nutrition and lifestyle, or the chronic diseases of aging. These are diseases that are largely driven by nutrition and lifestyle. And this represents over 80% of the chronic disease burden. 8 of 10 of us will die from diseases of civilization, diseases of nutrition and lifestyle. And again, at the center of these diseases, things like heart disease, things like dementia and Alzheimer's, cancer, chronic kidney disease, and not every type of cancer, but I would say a large majority of the types of cancers that you can get, and many, many other diseases that are major killers for us, are at the center of this is this story of metabolic health, insulin So understanding this in the proper way, and I think as you'll hear Alex talk, you'll slowly come to realize that I think, and certainly he thinks, that many people are not understanding this in the right way in terms of how we view the root causes of these problems and how we view the solutions. So with that said, Alex, give people an overview of, maybe I'll let you decide kind of how you want to introduce this, but this topic of metabolic health, people have heard that phrase before, but maybe I would bet a large portion of people don't actually know what metabolic health means. And then maybe introduce the idea of insulin resistance and blood glucose control in that picture.
Yeah. Yeah. So the way I would want to start describing metabolic health, and the way I think it's most accurate, is metabolic health basically refers to your ability to handle energy. And I want to very quickly emphasize the importance of the word energy there, because I know that there are many people who have a visceral dislike of the idea of calories. In fact, I've heard people make arguments about it, calories are just energy. They aren't related to your body mass. You need to be more concerned with like your fat balance, right? What is how much fat you're losing versus how much you're putting on. Um, and while I don't necessarily agree with that, right, the idea of fat balance makes sense. Fundamentally, energy is what matters, because everything in our body, every physical structure, and all the food we eat contains potential energy. It all contains energy that our body, our enzymes work to then break down, transfer, use to transform matter into other matter. And like, this is fundamentally how our bodies work and how every living organism works, is you take energy and you use it to manipulate the matter in your body. Um, and the two things are equal, by the way. I want to emphasize Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, stands for E, energy, equals mass times the speed of light squared. So you can actually equalize energy to mass. They aren't two totally separate things. They can go back and forth. And that's what happens in our body. So metabolic health is your ability to handle energy efficiently. That means when you get energy from the food that you eat, because we need to eat to survive, we're not plants, we can't rely on sunlight exclusively, then what does our body do with it? How efficiently is our body able to take that energy, absorb it from our digestive tract, transfer it through our bloodstream to all of the different organs and tissues that need it, and then either use it or store it? How well does that happen? And then the reverse, when you aren't eating, how well is your body able to sustain yourself and give you a thriving life, relying on the energy it has previously stored? That's what I think metabolic health is. And so people who have great metabolic health, they can eat a lot of food, they'll have a healthy body composition with very robust tissues that are able to do their job effectively of either burning up the energy or storing it for later. And then they're able to take that energy when they're not eating and effortlessly feed it from their storage depots into the organs and tissues that need it without there being any hiccups that could inhibit function. And so, a lot of people, I would say colloquially, people will say, like, well, when you fast for, longer than an overnight fast, do you get hungry? Do you have brain fog? Are you fatigued? These are all signs that your body isn't efficiently able to draw upon its own energy stores and then use that energy to keep you going. Whereas somebody with more robust metabolic health will wake up, they'll have lots of energy, they'll have a desire for movement, they'll have more kind of things that historically would give us food seeking behaviors, right? Because you can't be lethargic and brain fogged if you need to go hunt to get food. If your body's working optimally, you're going to be zoned in. You're going to have higher stress hormones that are going to facilitate that process, and you're going to have more energy often until you eat, and then things will kind of level out.
Mhm.
So people with poor metabolic health, when they do eat, they experience problems with blood glucose, blood lipids, energy storage systems are dysfunctional. Their mitochondria can't use the energy effectively, so they're fatigued all the time. They have brain fog, they can't think. And people with good metabolic health have the opposite. They think great. When they eat, they get energy from eating, but they have energy also when they don't eat.
Mhm.
There isn't any of these ups and downs. Um, and I would say that's actually another part of it. People with problems with metabolic health, after they eat, they feel crappy. Maybe they have the slumps, they get sleepy, they're tired. It's because their body's not responding appropriately to the food.
Yeah. I might want to actually circle back to something that you're describing here, which I think is interesting and worth talking about as we get into this, which is um, there is a tendency that we have in our sort of in our society, this moment in our culture and kind of the paradigms of medicine and the dominant paradigms of thinking around health, where we would tend to view like the way to measure poor metabolic health as doing a blood test and seeing various markers on there, maybe fasting blood glucose and other markers of triglycerides and cholesterol and things that relate to metabolic syndrome, blood pressure, and so on. Maybe inflammatory markers as signs of metabolic health. But a lot of the things that you just mentioned are actually sort of macro level phenomenon that are easily observable in yourself on a daily basis. Like how well do you wake up with a lot of energy? How well do you sustain energy if you go many hours without eating food? Do you have stable energy levels throughout the day, or do you find they dip and you crash every few hours and require food to keep yourself going? How do you feel after eating? Do you have trouble with your blood glucose levels and energy levels after eating, and so on? These markers of energy and energy in relationship to periods of feeding or periods of not feeding, and so on, become what I would argue are actually probably better indicators of metabolic health than anything that would show up on your blood test. Which I think is related to a lot of the stuff we're going to get into in this discussion. But let me have you go to the next step, which is insulin resistance and diabetes specifically. So how does that tie into this story of metabolic health? What is, everybody at this point has heard of certainly diabetes, and they probably understand that insulin resistance, or this idea of insulin sensitivity, and blood glucose levels, high or low in the normal range, are somehow tied into this story of metabolic health. Can you paint that picture for people of how that aspect of the story ties into metabolic health more broadly?
Yeah. So so first, I guess it's important to emphasize that there's two types of diabetes, right? There's type 1 and type 2. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition where your immune cells attack and destroy your pancreatic beta cells that produce insulin. So all of the kind of the pathology and everything we're going to be talking about is focused on type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes can't be compared, honestly. The causes are just wildly different for the most part. There's a little overlap. Um, but if diabetes is, based on your blood glucose levels, if you don't make insulin, your blood glucose rises. And that's type 1 diabetes. There's no insulin resistance. Someone could have perfect metabolic health and they would have diabetes because their pancreas is literally destroyed by their immune system, right? So again, there's that physical structure breakdown is now causing all of these biochemical things that we like to measure. Um, but for most people, for 90% of diabetes cases, type 2 diabetes. And this is the apex of metabolic dysfunction. Like it's the tip of the mountain, or the peak of the mountain that you would reach if you let metabolic dysfunction just continue without intervening to stop it.
Alex,
And
let me have you go one more piece of context. So you
yeah,
mentioned that sort of the proportions of type 1 versus type 2 diabetes in terms of the overall pool of total numbers of cases of diabetes. But what about the context of, as far as the proportion of people with diabetes that relates to the total pool of the chronic disease burden more broadly, and all these other diseases like heart disease and cancer, and chronic kidney disease and dementia and Alzheimer's and so many others? Like, what to what degree is type 1 diabetes contributing to that versus type 2 diabetes?
oh man, uh, I would say type 1 diabetes isn't even kind of on the radar with that.
Yeah,
Type
that's what I
1
wanted people
diabetes.
to understand.
Yeah,
Like when we're talking
yeah,
about chronic
type
disease burden more broadly, we're talking about type 2 diabetes.
yeah, type 1 diabetes brings with it a host of problems, right? Like it'll literally kill you if you don't manage it with insulin. And that in that case, like that's a necessity to keep you alive. Uh, but as long as you keep it managed, the rest of your metabolic health, as long as that's in good shape, you're at no increased risk of disease. I have several friends that have had type 1 diabetes since childhood, and they're, some of the healthiest people I know because they take care of themselves. They maintain strong physical structures in their bodies. Um, Now, oh, and sorry, amusingly, and they all inject insulin out of necessity, but they aren't fat. Okay, so just had to point that out for the insulin equals fat gain people. Um, but anyway, yeah, type 2 diabetes uh, is, a leading cause of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and neurodegeneration. Because once you start having a breakdown of your metabolic health, that affects literally every organ system in your body. Because now every organ system in your body, your blood vessels, your brain, your muscle tissue, your fat tissue, they aren't getting the energy that they need, or they aren't able to use that energy properly, while simultaneously being exposed to more energy than they can safely deal with. So it's like, man, imagine that. This might be a bad example, but let's say you had a car and you cut off half of the gas tank, so now you have half the room for gas. But then at the same time, you're letting gas just overflow the car. It's two related but separate issues. You can't use as much energy, which your cells need to function properly, and you're getting so much energy tried to be jammed in them that it's spilling over and damaging other components. Uh, this doesn't just happen overnight. And I want to emphasize this because I think you mentioned earlier that, 9 out of 10 people are considered to be metabolically unhealthy in the US.
I didn't mention
Um,
that, but it's a good thing to mention.
okay.
There was a study that the one that showed 88% of U.S. adults are in poor metabolic health. And then I saw
Yes.
actually a recent one as we were writing this recent chapter for the book. There was another study a few years later that I think measured it in a slightly different way, and they found like 94%, an even higher number.
Yeah. Yeah. And in those studies, what they're doing is they're taking physical measurements, so they're looking at people's obesity and that type of thing, and then they're combining it with markers of metabolic dysfunction, the biochemical markers that we like to measure because it's easy, and they say 9 out of 10 people aren't healthy. Now, diagnosed diabetes in the US is at about 12% of the population. There's another, 15 to 20% estimated to be undiagnosed because these people just don't go to the doctor. And then everyone else in that difference, so let's say that's what 60, yeah, so like 60% of the population is in between. They aren't healthy, but they're not yet at diabetes. You could say, they have pre-diabetes. You could say they have metabolic syndrome, whatever.
I,
The point is,
I think it's important to understand. I think a lot of people don't grasp the concept that this is really a spectrum that we're talking about. Like people, I think, have been taught to think of diabetes or even pre-diabetes, quote unquote, as like well-defined conditions that sort of you either have it or you don't. And once you have it, then you have this disease that needs to be treated in XYZ way. And I personally think, and I hope you'll explain, I'm going to ask you to explain this, the idea of insulin resistance and sensitivity as a spectrum. And that
yeah,
where we define specific cutoffs to say this XYZ is a disease state is really, to a large extent, kind of arbitrary. But a better way to understand this is a spectrum of optimal insulin sensitivity versus high levels of insulin resistance.
yeah. So I think a little later we're going to get into the structural breakdowns that cause metabolic dysfunction and diabetes. So I'm not going to go into that at this time, but what I am going to say is that fundamentally, what's causing type 2 diabetes to occur, which is the elevated blood glucose, is that there are problems with insulin receptors on cells where they become less responsive. And it's a spectrum, right? You can have maybe they're 90% responsive compared to completely healthy. Maybe they're 80, 50, 30, and it just keeps getting worse and worse. And when insulin isn't able to bind to these receptors effectively and transmit the signal telling the cell to take up glucose from the bloodstream, then your blood glucose starts to rise or stay elevated after eating. Now, these receptors exist on virtually every cell in the body, and depending on where insulin is binding will determine what the effects are. So in the case of diabetes, when insulin's binding to muscle tissue or fat tissue, it's telling those cells to take up the glucose and either use it for energy or store it for later. And that storage can be in the form of glycogen in muscle or as fat tissue in your fat tissue. On somewhere like the liver, insulin's job is to actually not just tell the liver to take up glucose, but for the liver to stop creating glucose from other precursors like amino acids. And the primary reason why someone's fasting blood glucose elevates when they have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes is because of the liver. The liver is not receiving insulin signal to shut off its glucose making abilities. And so even when you're not eating, it continuously pumps out glucose into your blood that it makes from things like amino acids. And, doctors will see this and they'll say, oh, your fasting glucose is high. This is how we're going to diagnose you with either prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. Now, do they ever tell you, why that's happening at a fundamental level? No. They just tell you your blood glucose is high. And I don't know, maybe you should lose weight or you should go on a low carb diet or whatever because your body isn't handling carbohydrates and glucose in your body properly. But fundamentally, it's the biochemistry is a symptom of the actual structural defects that are occurring in the body that are leading this to happen.
Okay, so let's before we get into that, what you're just alluding to there, let's go into the conventional, sort of the standard conventional ways that most people within conventional medical circles, and I would say within natural health and functional medicine circles, for the most part, tend to understand the physiology of insulin resistance and the way that they think about causation and treatment. So can you kind of explain how they tend to conceptualize this? Because I want to, and I want you to do it in a charitable and a generous way. I don't want you to misrepresent, like,
Yeah.
I want you to be generous to their perspective, present it as fairly as possible. And then after we do that, then I want to contrast it with kind of the new perspective, the new paradigm that you want to present on insulin resistance.
Yeah. So I'll do kind of the conventional and then I'll do what I would consider maybe the more alternative way of looking at it.
Great.
And both ways actually, address it pretty decently. We think that they're missing some important parts, but I mean, ultimately, they're keeping people alive. And what they do, conventional, let's say you go to the doctor, your blood glucose is elevated. Uh, the doctor is probably going, the first line, let me say this, the first line of treatment from a conventional medical standpoint is to put you on metformin. Because what metformin does is they say, hey, your blood glucose is elevated. We're doctors, and so we know that diabetes comes from insulin resistance, right? They definitely know that. They know kind of how it's caused. And they say, okay, insulin resistance, so low insulin sensitivity, let's give you metformin, which is going to increase your insulin sensitivity and help your body naturally put blood glucose back where it's supposed to go in your muscle and fat tissue instead of having it hang out in your blood. And it
Boom.
works.
Problem solved, diabetes cured, right?
Well, maybe, if that doesn't work, right? Because for a lot of people, metformin doesn't get their blood glucose under control. Maybe it helps a little, but for a lot of people, they might not even have diabetes anymore, but they're still pre-diabetic. It's not that they're healthy; it's just they're less unhealthy. And if the problem persists, or even if it gets worse, despite being on something like metformin, you know, first they'll increase the dose. And once they reach the kind of max dose of metformin, they'll be like, you need to go on insulin. And then they're just going to have you start injecting more insulin. Because if you inject more insulin, well, now you're going to logically have more insulin signaling at the receptors, and you're going to kind of force blood glucose away into various tissues.
I might be jumping ahead here, but let's say that let's use insulin. Let's leave metformin out of the picture for a minute. Let's say you just to talk about insulin in the way you just described. Let's say that you used insulin and you used it effectively to, meaning injecting extra insulin beyond what your body's producing. You used it effectively to keep your blood glucose in a relatively normal range to prevent it from being elevated. Does that mean that you don't have insulin resistance or diabetes anymore?
It doesn't have any effect on whether you have insulin resistance or not.
Right.
But from a diagnostic standpoint, you could not meet the diagnostic criteria for diabetes
Well,
technically.
that's a different discussion. I don't think I certainly don't care about that. I care whether there's an actual problem or not
Yeah,
our degree of the ability to measure the extent of the problem based on our diagnostic
yeah.
criteria.
So here's the thing too. Uh, there's reasons why your insulin receptors become desensitized to insulin. And one of the reasons in kind of a positive feedback loop is that the more insulin you have circling around, the more the receptors become desensitized to it as a protective mechanism, because your cells aren't stupid. I think cells aren't just these little robots that just sit there and work in a very fixed manner. They're dynamic. They're constantly looking at what's going on around and within them and then adapting to that. And so when a cell has a problem and it says, hey, we have a problem and this is causing our insulin receptors to not reach the surface because we don't want that to happen, then you're going to inject insulin and kind of force more energy into that cell, which is going to just aggravate that problem. And that cell is going to withdraw even more insulin receptors from its surface. And you're going to have to continually inject more and more insulin to get the same effect. And in a sense, you're actually going to worsen the original problem, even though the symptoms of the disease seem like they're in control.
I want to make the distinction that I think what you're presenting now, this idea of, and you're alluding to the idea that there is an intelligence behind insulin resistance, that it's not purely the body's being dumb and this is a pathology, this is a disease, a problem of the body because the dumb body can't figure out how to control blood glucose. you're saying, which is, I think, introducing a novel perspective that is not typically um, seen by most people within conventional medicine, and maybe, I don't know to what extent this is now common among natural health and functional medicine people. But I think in general, in conventional medicine, they see this as a pathology, not as the body intelligently making the cells more insulin resistant to protect themselves. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So with all due respect, I think you're jumping a little bit ahead in introducing some of the more novel perspectives. I want you to come back to the conventional medical and more typical sort of functional medical ways of viewing the physiology and the mechanisms of insulin resistance.
So yeah, conventional will say your blood glucose is elevated. Let's try and increase your insulin sensitivity using drugs. And if that doesn't work, we're just going to try and overpower your body by using hormones. And those hormones are just going to force your body to do things maybe it doesn't want to. Now, in this situation, the underlying causes are never being addressed. They're just being managed because they're focused on the biochemistry. In a similar way, I would say a lot of alternative kind of practitioners will either use supplements that have effects that are basically identical to metformin, such as berberine, which is the same active ingredient as metformin. Um, and maybe they'll try.
Is it the same actual active ingredient, or is it another chemical that works in a very similar way through the same mechanism?
Oh, so okay. I don't know that, but metformin and berberine, when compared head to head, have almost identical effects on the outcomes,
Okay.
to where they could be exchanged, dose for dose, and have same outcome.
Mhm.
But so they'll try maybe supplements because they have this idea that if it's not a pharmaceutical, then that's a-okay. Drugs are bad, but supplements aren't, which is a really kind of arbitrary distinction, since they're both concentrated molecules that we use to have drug-like effects in the body.
I will say, to be charitable to that view, I think in general, it is actually a good bias to have. Like, I think you can make the argument that you just made that it doesn't matter whether the chemical that we're talking about is natural or artificial. However, I think that when we look at the literature more broadly and the way the body interacts with a wide variety, a huge variety of thousands of different natural chemicals, and the way that it tends to interact with artificial man-made chemicals, um, I think we can legitimately say that the side effect profile is, as a generalization, tends to be a much higher risk of adverse effects from man-made chemicals as opposed to natural chemicals. Again, all things being equal, I am totally aware that there are things in nature that are highly poisonous that can kill you.
Yeah.
But I think like that is a legitimate bias that we can have towards natural stuff as opposed to artificial stuff that I think is legitimate. Like, for example, just as a random point of contact in this discussion, compare natural scents, let's say from strongly scented things from nature, essential oils, flowers, etc. Wood, like Palo Santo wood that has a strong smell and things like that. And we compare the physiological effects of those compounds versus man-made artificial perfumes and scents that you would have in a Glade plug-in or something. Those things tend to have, like, we know they have phthalates, we know they have endocrine disrupting compounds in them. As a generalization, those things tend to have generally no positive effects and lots of adverse effects, whereas the natural compounds tend to be much more in the other direction. Yeah, with heavy doses, maybe you could encounter some adverse effects, but with reasonable doses in the range that most people would get, they tend to only have positive effects. So I will say all of that is to just say that there is a reasonable basis for the bias towards natural versus man-made?
So I agree, actually. And I'll just give one more example of that. If you think of like sleep medicines, pharmaceutical sleep medicines basically make you go unconscious. So you're not actually getting any restorative sleep. Whereas, there's numerous supplements, and you put, a lot of them in your sleep supplement that more so push the body into wanting to go to sleep and stay asleep, rather than just shutting it off completely.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's I agree with you. Um,
But it's also true, as you, to your point, that like in this particular context of insulin resistance, essentially they're viewing this problem in the same way. They're viewing the problem and the solution in the same way. Here's this pathology in the body. The body's dumb. It's insulin resistant. Let's force it to take more glucose in the cell by using X or Y chemical, X versus Y. One is natural, one is man-made.
yeah. And oftentimes, and this is where I think the alternative route is superior to conventional medicine, is they won't jump to those solutions quite as readily. And their first line approach is usually dietary changes and ideally lifestyle as well. And I think in this field, the most common dietary change is to have people go on a low carb or ketogenic diet. And frankly, I think it's a good idea. The reason being that elevated blood glucose is directly harmful to numerous organ systems. If you can rapidly drop that with a ketogenic diet, uh, while you work on addressing the underlying causes, okay, because it's not caused by carbohydrates, right? It's just that carbohydrates are what allow the disease to express itself. So the analogy is like celiac disease. If you want to be diagnosed for celiac disease, you actually have to eat gluten for several days before they can do the diagnostic test. Because if you don't eat gluten, the disease does not present. They can't say, "Oh, your intestinal cells are starting to be destroyed. You definitely have celiac disease." They can't do that because without gluten, nothing's happening.
Mm-hmm.
With type 2 diabetes, if you're not eating glucose and you're on a ketogenic diet, not everyone, but I would definitely argue for most people, the disease isn't going to show up. Not because you don't have it, but because our diagnostic criteria are based on carbohydrates being in the diet. So, you could have all the structural problems going on that cause diabetes, but as soon as you stop eating carbs, your blood glucose and your blood insulin rapidly fall because those things are primarily dictated by the carbohydrate content of your diet and your metabolic response to them, right? That's the insulin component. So I think it's a good plan to prevent damage while you work to address the issue. But again, you're not actually addressing what's causing the insulin resistance to begin with, at least not directly.
So this is an important distinction because many people will go on a low carb or keto diet, and many people who have insulin resistance or diabetes, they'll go on this diet, their blood sugar is in the normal range, and then it's like, hey, I went low carb and keto, I don't have pre-diabetes or diabetes anymore, problem solved. And you're saying that is not the correct interpretation of that.
Yeah. In fact, I would argue if you're on a low carb diet, eat some carbohydrates, because if you can't eat carbohydrates in your diet without something going wrong, you're not metabolically healthy. And so you can be on that ketogenic diet and think everything's okay, but you're kind of masking the problem, or you're avoiding confronting it.
It's like I have a bum knee, and as long as I'm on crutches and I take the weight off this leg, I don't feel any problem with my knee. As soon as
Yeah.
I go to try to use my leg and walk on that leg by getting rid of the crutches, stretches, now I experience that my knee has a problem.
Yeah, exactly. And oftentimes people eating ketogenic diets are big fans of kind of the ancestral way of looking at things. And so I think it's important then too to emphasize that carbohydrates have been a primary energy source of most ancestral diets. Um,
And
Pretty much,
we can say this, given all the back and forth and all the competing claims for, the diet of our ancestors, quote unquote, I want to emphasize to listeners, Alex and I can say this pretty definitively because we have spent a very, very long time researching this exact question and writing about in extensive details the diets of our ancestors. If anybody's inclined to question whether we're biased or they're skeptical of what we're saying on this, I would encourage you to look at the work of Stefan Lindeberg, who is a researcher who traveled all over the world and meticulously documented the diets of tribes in Africa, in the South Pacific, in South America, and many, many places all over the world. And there is, of course, variation. Like the Inuit diet in the Arctic is very different from the Hadza in Africa, which is very different from the Tukisenta and the Kitavans and other people in the South Pacific, which largely has to do with just lack of availability of plant foods because most of the landscape is frozen. Um, but
but
but there is individual variability, but there is simply no question that the majority of the ancestral human diet, particularly of our human ancestors that were closer to the equator, where we're thought to originate in Africa, eat diets that are predominated by carbohydrates.
yeah, and I mean this is a kind of tangential point, but what you just mentioned, how there's variation, um, there's no one human diet. Like we are incredibly adaptive creatures. We're opportunistic eaters, and people were able to survive and thrive on those diversity of diets just depending on what was available.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of
Uh,
an amazing thing that human populations can survive on, the Tukisenta people in Papua New Guinea are eating like 95% roots and tubers, like
yep.
things analogous to sweet potatoes. Um, and on the other hand, you have like the Inuit in the Arctic on whale blubber and fish and, maybe an occasional berry or two, you know,
Yeah.
and extreme low carb diets, mostly devoid of plant foods,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that humans can survive and thrive in any number of circumstances on any number of diets is a pretty remarkable phenomenon.
Yeah. Um, the final point I'll say with regard to that too is people get tripped up when they think that meat was important for evolution, therefore we are meat eaters.
Mm.
And I just kind of want to emphasize that we started as herbivores, and we started after we kind of invented fire. Really, we started cooking tubers that made their energy much more available. If you've ever compared a raw potato to a cooked potato, one's basically all fiber, right, and the other is all digestible carb. And then we started eating meat, cooking the meat, which makes it more digestible. Eating it, meat played a central role in our evolution, letting us have smaller guts, bigger brains. We were definitely avid hunters. Meat was definitely a preferred food source because it was so energy and nutrient dense. Like it just made sense from a survival standpoint. None of that means that we did not also regularly consume carbohydrates in the diet. So just want to emphasize that.
Yeah, good point. Okay,
Bringing it,
let's circle back just to
yeah,
this. Just can you crystallize this idea of how most people view insulin resistance, and then we'll move on to the new paradigm.
yeah. People say, hey, you're insulin resistant, you have high blood glucose. Let's increase your insulin sensitivity or do other things that lower your blood glucose. We're not going to make any structural changes. What we're going to do is either give you a drug that increases insulin receptor expression, or we're going to change your diet to where, hey, if you're not eating carbs, then your blood glucose is normal. That's great. And those are the I would say the two most common kind of paradigms.
It's to be a way of conceptualizing insulin resistance that sees it as a biochemistry problem.
Exactly.
With a biochemistry or pharmaceutical solution or chemical solution if it's a natural chemical.
Yeah.
Okay.
And even the dietary change can be thought of as a biochemical change because their focus is on blood glucose, right? It's on that biochemical marker. And by manipulating the diet, they're specifically trying to manipulate your blood glucose levels.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So with that said, and I know you've actually already alluded to the new paradigm a number of times, but let me have you introduce this new way of thinking about the root cause of insulin resistance.
So your cells are not structurally robust, and because structure dictates function, their function is no longer advantageous to your health. The more that you dig, the more that you realize that the cause of diabetes is fundamentally cellular dysfunction. And that can be brought on by several ways that we'll talk about, but that's ultimately the crossroads is cellular dysfunction, which is causing these cells to be insulin resistant, which is then driving these biochemical changes in your body because the dysfunctional cells are not acting in the way that they should.
I want people to get this idea of structure dictating function, because I think we are all so trained in this culture, in Western culture, certainly in the US, to think of health in biochemical terms, to think of our health as a result of whatever is the list of items that show up on our blood test results at the doctor. Health, we think of health as we are a product of the chemicals, the levels of these chemicals and different compounds floating around in our bloodstream. And this idea of structure is a different way of conceptualizing health. Like, imagine imagine a bicycle, right? And imagine having a trapezoid-shaped wheel on your bicycle. How well is that bike going to work compared to if it's a circular wheel? The structure of that wheel, the physical structure at the macro level, not biochemicals, not micro level biochemicals, but the physical macro level structure of what's happening in that bike profoundly impacts how well it functions. We are so good at understanding something like that, with a bicycle, and I would argue we are so bad about applying the same logic and the same common sense to us, to ourselves as humans, when it comes to understanding our own health, to understanding the link between physical structure of our bodies and our physical function, our function, and ultimately our health and disease outcomes. So go in more detail about this, what you mean by structure, what is under the banner, the umbrella of this idea of the physical structure of our body, and then segue into how that is affecting the function of systems that relate to insulin resistance and metabolic health.
Yeah, so a really easy example of this to think about further, just to emphasize the structure component, is I'm going to give two examples here. First, with your muscle tissue, because I think this is really easy for people to visualize. What happens if you have very small, weak, frail muscles, right? Their physical structure of your muscle is not very good, and the outcome of that is you're weak, you're at an increased risk of falls, you're at increased risk of injury from those falls, like, a hip fracture or many other things that are the leading causes of death and disability among elderly adults, because they are who this physical breakdown of their muscle tissue, they're who are primarily affected by it, right? Just as kind of a meta example of that, uh, you solve that by doing resistance training, right? And eating food to support the growth of new muscle tissue. It's literally, hey, our muscles are weak. We're not going to, go look at your biochemistry and be like, oh, well, let's see how much creatinine are they responding? What's your blood urea like? It's like, no, none of that is relevant. The issue is a weak muscle. Let's build the physical structure. Let's make it stronger. And guess what a side effect of this is? Your muscle tissues are responsible for 80% of glucose disposal after eating.
Alex,
So,
hold on one second before you go there. I want to add one thing to this point
yeah,
of muscles. Um, we can visually look at someone, and based on how they appear to us, like using our eyes, observing the macro level physical structure of their body, we can very easily and probably pretty darn accurately, not probably, pretty darn accurately guess their physical function of their strength level of those muscles based on looking at the physical structure of them. And so if somebody's got big, strong looking muscles, we go, oh, that person's probably really strong, right? If
yeah,
they're physically very frail and they have very skinny, flaccid muscles, you're going to look at them and think, no, that person's probably not very strong, right? This is very obvious. This is very, very common sense. Importantly, I want people to understand if you went and did blood tests of those two individuals, the one who visually you said that's a strong person and visually said that's a person who's pretty weak and frail. If you did blood tests and what you looked at was a 10-page report of hundreds of different biomarkers in each of those people, but you didn't get to see them visually, you didn't get to actually look at their physical structure. All you had was what most people would think of as a much more cutting edge, much more scientifically sophisticated thing, which is this 10-page report of hundreds of things going on in their biochemistry. There is no analysis that you could do of all of that biochemistry mark, no matter how sophisticated. You could add microbiome tests, gene tests, you could add all the tests you want. You still will not be able to, by any of that data, have come anywhere close to as accurately predicting how strong or weak a person's physical muscles are as you would have by just a 5-second observation or a 1-second observation of a person's physical structure. So I want people to get like just how predictive simple observations of macro level physical structure are, and that this is not only not less scientific or less sophisticated or cutting edge than a biochemistry analysis would be. In many cases, it is actually far more accurate of a predictor of a person's physiological function than any analysis and any comprehensiveness of biochemistry tests.
yeah. And I want to add to that too. Biochemistry is just a snapshot in time. And so what gets overlooked is the future risk of something happening. So in your example, the two people could metabolically be equal at that point in time. 1 year from then, the person who is very weak with low muscle tissue is much more likely to have developed metabolic problems from that low muscle tissue, because a breakdown in physical structure has a cascading effect. And the more time you spend, on that road, the worse it gets.
Yeah.
So so you can't just look at one snapshot in time and think it's going to stay that way. That's the problem. People think it's it's not. Remember, your body is always adapting to what it has to work with.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you for letting me interrupt you. You were about to segue from the physical muscles example to actually then talking about tying in physical muscles, tying in one's muscles to the story of insulin resistance and metabolic health.
Yeah, your muscles are responsible for 80% of glucose disposal after eating. The bigger and more in use your muscles are, so the more that you use your muscles for even light movement, but also, lifting things, going for runs, whatever you want to, like, whatever, those muscles are going to rely on stored glycogen within them as a very quick energy source to power all of those contractions. And what that's going to do is that's going to free up a lot of room within those muscles to store more glucose, because your body's going to say, we're constantly going through this glycogen. We want to increase our storage capacity of it. So now whenever you eat carbohydrates, your cells are going to say, give me those carbs, and they're going to push not insulin receptors, they're going to push glucose transporters to the cell surface, the same transporters that are normally put there in response to insulin, but they're going to do it voluntarily. And they're going to suck up glucose without you actually even needing to have an insulin response to eating, because they want that. They are adaptive. They say, we want that carbs, and we're going to store it in your muscles for later use. And that's great metabolic health. Like, your body doesn't even need a big insulin response. It doesn't need a hormonal signal, because your muscle tissue itself is just ready for the glucose. So to add to this too, I want to emphasize that insulin doesn't increase before you eat. What happens is when your blood glucose levels rise, some of that glucose just passively, it's a very low threshold, right? It just passively moves into the pancreas, produces energy, and that energy production in the pancreas is what stimulates the pancreas to then secrete insulin. So the insulin is a response to the glucose. If your muscles are all saying, give me glucose, as soon as that glucose hits your blood, then your liver and your muscle tissues are going to suck it up before you have enough of it to get into your pancreas. So instead of having a huge insulin response, your pancreas is going to think, maybe you only had a few grams of carbohydrates, when in reality you had a full meal, because the rest of your tissues were eager to suck it up before your pancreas ever got a chance.
Yeah.
And
Sorry,
no,
go ahead.
I was just going to say that's exactly what you want to happen. That is your body working efficiently, and that's your body working as it should. And it is a result of building big, strong muscles that you constantly use. The exact opposite happens when you're weak and you're frail. Your muscles are not only, you're never using them, so they don't have any more room to store glycogen because you're never burning through it. And because your muscles are so tiny, you simply can't store as much glycogen as you could if you had bigger muscles.
Yeah.
It's a direct result of what's going on with the physical structure of your muscle.
I like how there's a subtle thing that happened there, which was using muscles, big, strong muscles, as an example of the link between structure and function in terms of, just presenting this sort of as an analogy, as a way of understanding the structure-function link. Like, hey, look at somebody, there's big, strong muscles, and you can reasonably assume there's strength. This person is a strong person that can move heavy objects. And then you subtly actually transitioned into big, strong muscles as the structure, in terms of the physiological role that they play in insulin resistance, not just in terms of the function of lifting heavy objects, but the function in terms of metabolic health and soaking up glycogen, acting as a glycogen sink. So just wanted to make sure listeners caught that. That was a nice little subtle flow of concepts. So what you just explained is the role of physical structure of muscles in insulin resistance and metabolic health. Why muscles are more than just a thing about vanity, but actually play a central role in our metabolic health. But having said that, there is one other layer of the story of body composition and physical structure that is an even more important player in the story of insulin resistance. So take people through that.
That one would be your fat tissue. So again, this is actually something you can, for the most part, look at and visualize on someone. Your body fat, if it's working properly, it should store energy pretty readily and then give it up pretty readily as needed, right? So it will respond to the signals your body puts out, and it will say, hey, they ate an extra big meal this time. Muscles got their fill. They're happy. We have some leftover. We're going to put it in fat tissue and store it for later, because having that energy in the bloodstream is harmful because it's going to interact with a bunch of things it shouldn't. So let's safely store it away. And then, they're probably not going to eat for a bit. And so we'll start to pull on that energy and use it to sustain ourselves until they eat again. Now, what happens now if a fat cell isn't working properly? If it has a physical breakdown of its structure, then you're not going to be able to store that excess energy, not easily anyway. And this directly causes diabetes, type 2 diabetes. But also, I would just emphasize it's going to cause metabolic problems directly. And there's a really good example of this. It's a disease. It's called lipodystrophy. And this is a disease where fat cells basically just don't work. So, it can affect just isolated parts of the body, or it can affect the entire body. But it's a disease where your fat cells cannot store energy. They have a defect, right? A genetic defect that led to structural problems that make them incapable of storing excess energy. And these people have substantial levels of insulin resistance by definition, because their cells just don't store the energy, and they have type 2 diabetes and a host of metabolic problems because any excess energy in their blood has nowhere to go. And these people need to work around their condition by doing two things. They need to constantly be moving to free up as much space as possible in muscle tissue to take care of excess energy. And they need to eat very small, frequent meals because they cannot have too much energy in their blood at any given time, or else it will hurt them. Now, the same thing is the most common cause of type 2 diabetes, but for a different reason.
The most common cause of insulin resistance, more broadly,
Yes.
right?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. But the reason's different. It's not due to some genetic defect. It's because their fat cells have stored so much energy that the cell says, hey, I can't put more energy inside me, so I'm going to shut myself off from insulin signal. Because if I did put more energy inside me, it would risk causing damage to me as a cell.
Right.
Well, think of a balloon. You can't blow infinite amounts of air into a balloon. At some point, it would pop. The physical structure would give out. It's the exact same with fat cells. Your fat cells can only store so much fat, and uh, there is a genetic component to how much fat an individual can store. Some people have a lot of fat cells, and they have an ability where when their fat cells get too big, those fat cells start to release signaling molecules that lead to the creation of new fat cells. And as long as this process continues to occur, these people can actually become morbidly obese and not have any biochemical signs of metabolic dysfunction.
And this gets into the I guess controversial territory of the obese but metabolically healthy category. The idea that some people have put forth that it's possible to be extremely overweight and yet still metabolically healthy.
Yeah. So, technically they're right. But 2 points I want to raise is the first is that research looking at these people shows that even though they're metabolically healthy at a point in time, they're at a 50 to 80% greater risk of developing metabolic problems within 5 years of them being metabolically healthy. Um, and that's simply because even though their bodies are just amazing at storing fat and doing that, the process is limited. Like it's going to give out at some point. The second point I want to raise is um, even if you're metabolically healthy, you're still going to have massive joint degeneration. Your physical structure of your skeleton is not used to carrying all that weight. And so you're going to have a physical breakdown in other ways that aren't related to what's going on in your bloodstream. I mean, you can ask anyone like, hey, why don't you wear a 100-pound weight vest for the entire day? And then the next day, take it off and let me know how your back feels, right? Let me know how your knees feel. Carrying that excess weight's just, it's not healthy from a physical structure standpoint. Um, but anyway, so the reason this fat cell dysfunction is the primary cause of insulin resistance for most people, which ultimately leads to type 2 diabetes, is because they have too much body fat and they have reached their capacity to store more body fat. And so all of their fat cells have basically said, we're going to protect ourselves, so we're going to turn away any further energy. Now, the body doesn't like this. It's almost like there's two minds to the body, right? So on the one hand, you have cells that are looking after themselves, and on the other hand, you have cells that are also looking after the body in general. So your fat cells are saying, hey, I can't do anymore, it's going to hurt me. But now you still have a bunch of energy, a bunch of glucose in your blood, and your pancreas is going to say, wow, all this glucose, I better pump out more insulin because that's my job. And so now you have more insulin in your bloodstream, which is going to override these safety mechanisms of these fat cells, right? It's going to try and force more energy into them. And this is the very first step in not insulin resistance, but into metabolic dysfunction, because this is now what causes these fat cells to become dysfunctional. And what happens at this stage is these fat cells, they're now considered lipid overloaded. So they have too much fat in them. And this stimulates an immune response against the fat cells. So now your immune system is saying, hold on, this fat cell is dysfunctional. This is a danger to the body. I need to start attacking it. And so you have a lot of this localized inflammation in the fat cells that then spreads throughout the body. This is how low-grade inflammation starts. It starts in your fat cells, and then all of these immune signaling molecules that cause inflammation, because inflammation is just an active immune system. That's all it means. Spread throughout the body so that you can recruit more immune cells to the area. These fat cells that are now so lipid overloaded that insulin no longer even has an effect on them start secreting their fat back into circulation because they're damaged, they're dysfunctional, they're being attacked by immune cells. Insulin, which is not just responsible for storing glucose, but for locking away energy to keep it out of the bloodstream, is no longer transmitting its signal. So now you have a leakage of fat back into the bloodstream. And this is why people with obesity and type 2 diabetes, from a biochemical standpoint, they have greatly elevated levels of fatty acids in their blood. It's because it's leaking back into circulation. Now, people get really focused on glucose. They think, hey, high glucose is bad. It causes glycation. We got to keep that in control. High fat in your blood is is equally as detrimental. There's just do a quick Google search for lipotoxicity, right? Having a bunch of fatty acids in your blood can cause damage to tissues. And so your body says, whoa, we can't let this happen, but we can't put this energy, these fats back into your body fat because those cells don't work anymore. So, but we need to get it out of the blood. So what we're going to do is we're going to start putting it in places where it shouldn't go. And this is what leads to the development of visceral fat, right? This is the fat that surrounds all of your organs. That fat ideally would be as minimal as possible. But when you have too much energy in your blood from your fat cell dysfunction, your body says, we need to get this out of the bloodstream. We're going to put it in the liver. We're going to put it in the pancreas. In fact, we're even going to shove some of it into muscle tissue, which is then going to, affect the physical function of the muscle tissue, reduce its insulin sensitivity. It's a whole cascading effect. And then in the liver, the buildup of fat in the liver causes the liver to become unresponsive to insulin, causes the liver to start secreting glucose uncontrollably, which elevates your fasting glucose level. The fat in the pancreas begins to interfere with its ability to create and secrete insulin. Over time, your pancreatic ability to create insulin actually goes down. And this is what happens when, people say that they're insulin dependent diabetes. It's because they have been in this state of physical structure breakdown for so long that it has now damaged their organs, and their pancreas now more resembles someone with type 1 diabetes because its physical structure was destroyed by this cascade of events that ultimately started in their body fat. And that sequence of events that I just described, you overdo your energy storage capacity, your fat cells become dysfunctional, they become inflammatory, fat gets secreted into your bloodstream, it gets stored in your organ tissues, those organs no longer function, and suddenly your blood fat and your blood glucose levels all rise, you're diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, and you're given some metformin thinking that that's going to solve the problem. No. It's fundamentally a structural breakdown, and I'm sure that you have a lot you want to say, Ari, but before that, the last thing I want to say is the solution, and this has been demonstrated now multiple times in the scientific literature, the solution to literally reversing diabetes to where you can actually eat carbohydrates without any problems.
Alex, hold on.
Yeah, all right.
Interrupt you right there for maximal suspense before you deliver the solution. So before you get there, let me ask you this. There are some people who listening to this, maybe their eyes are glazing over and they're saying, oh my God, this is so much detail with all these mechanisms. Why don't you just tell me what to do? Okay. And why does any of this actually matter? Why does it matter whether you conceptualize it as a biochemistry problem, a biochemical problem with a biochemical solution, or you conceptualize it this other way as a structural problem? Why does any of this matter at all? So the reason that it matters how you conceptualize it is because the way you conceptualize the problem is going to be the biggest determinant of how you conceptualize the solution to the problem. So with that said, Alex, now I want you to go into what you were about to say, which is now that we understand this as through a structural lens, through the lens of structure, physical structure dictating function and physiology, how does this new paradigm, this new understanding of insulin resistance lead us to a different way of conceptualizing the solutions to this problem?
So if you trace it all the way back to the ultimate cause, it's, you can trace it back to two parts, right? The diabetes starts because of excess fat in the liver and pancreas. But the excess fat gets in your liver and pancreas because you have too much fat on your body, right? So the subcutaneous fat that's beneath your skin. In both cases, the solution is fat loss. If you lose body fat, then you're if you're going to burn up the fat that is stored on your body, then you burn through the fat that's in your organ tissues, right? You use that for energy, so it's not there anymore. And you free up space in the fat cells beneath your skin so that they can now start to safely store and release energy properly again.
Okay, there's one intermediary linking those things that you just described here that I want to make sure we explain. One could make the case, I think reasonably, I think I would make this case, as much as I like this way of conceptualizing the real causes, quote unquote, of insulin resistance. I think we could make the case that what if we just keep going more upstream of even this? Okay, so we say, you were just kind of tracking something upstream of, okay, upstream of this fat cell dysfunction and the insulin resistance is the accumulation of fat in the liver and visceral adipose tissue. And what causes that? Well, okay, upstream of that is too much fat in the subcutaneous fat stores. Okay, now we need to ask, well, what causes that? Okay, okay, so what are the root causes of why we are accumulating too much subcutaneous fat stores? And this also, I want you to answer this by also stating the context that this problem is a modern human problem that doesn't exist in all those hunter-gatherer tribes that we were discussing before. So,
Yeah.
so if we're talking about real root causes, we need to understand the root causes of the structural dysfunction too, and why that is only present uniquely in modern humans living the modern Western lifestyle as opposed to our hunter-gatherer ancestors, the hunter-gatherer tribes who still exist today, who have been studied by researchers.
Yeah. So I'll go two more upstream causes. The cause of overfilled fat cells is simply that you're eating more energy than your body's able to use up, chronically over time. And then the reason why you're eating too much, I would argue, and I think Ari would agree, is that the modern Western diet is just a potpourri of hyper palatable, super calorie dense, completely unnatural foods that are literally engineered by people whose entire jobs is to make them taste good, to make us eat as much as possible. And this problem doesn't exist in any indigenous tribes because their diet, because one, they have to work for their diet, and two, their diet is composed exclusively of natural foods that we evolved eating, that our bodies are adapted to using.
By the way, quick side note, this also loops back into our previous discussion around natural versus man-made stuff and the potential for adverse effects between those
Yep.
two being considerably different. But that's a quick side note.
Yeah. And on that too, not every processed food is bad and harmful. You really kind of have to approach it with some common sense. You could find a nice jar of spirulina powder, right? That's ultra processed, but
Or whey protein or collagen.
yeah, but those are all, I would argue, very healthy things to include in the diet. Um, we're really, when we're talking about the foods that I think would come to mind for most everyone just when they hear the word ultra processed junk food. This is the stuff that lines the supermarket shelves, the stuff that is rich in fats, heavily processed and refined carbohydrates, salt, flavorings, everything that makes us want to eat it, and literally tricks our biology into consuming more of it, because from an evolutionary standpoint, all of these aspects of the food are what our biology is tuned towards for survival, right? When you're trying to survive out in the jungle or on the savanna, you want to eat calorie dense foods that are rich in carbohydrates like, sugar. Honey is a big one around equatorial tribes. They love honey. They will gorge on honey when they find it.
Same is also true in my personal household. I have two little children that also gorge on honey. And
Yeah.
I'm not gonna lie, I may also do that from time to time.
Yeah. It's an ingrained survival mechanism. And I mean, the gorging thing's actually a great pivot point too, because overeating's not inherently bad. Like, our bodies are designed to deal with periods of overeating, and they're designed to deal with periods of not eating at all.
Mm-hmm.
People don't get unhealthy because, maybe they binge over a weekend, uh, every now and then. People get unhealthy because they regularly consume really, really crappy foods that cause them to unconsciously overeat over a span of weeks, months, years, decades.
Okay, I want to add one thing. Again, context along with hunter-gatherers, our human ancestors, our sort of, you could say, our natural living counterparts. Um, if we look even more broadly to other animal species, none of these other animal species that we might observe, whether it's a zebra or a deer or a tiger or whatever, a squirrel or a raccoon or anything like that, none of these species have obesity epidemics. And they all, you don't see them walking around with huge amounts of fat stores, unless maybe they're preparing for hibernation, which is also an intelligent thing um, in hibernating animals. Um, and they're not starving to death, assuming they're in an environment that has food available to them. Um, they know how to regulate their level of body fat within a healthy range. And turns out, and humans do too, in a proper human environment, like the one that we evolved in. And so all hunter-gatherer tribes, when we look at them, they know how to regulate their body fat stores in a healthy way. And this is not a conscious thing. It's not that they went and read diet books and learned about calories, and that they go into their apps on their phones and count their calories every day and track their calorie expenditure. This is all done as a natural, non-conscious product of bioregulatory processes. And we have a body fat set point system that has been designed into us over millions of years. Prior to even the species of Homo sapiens, this system evolved. And this system involves a feedback loop between a certain area of the brain and the hypothalamus that is involved in this is called the body fat set point regulatory system. And it is in sync with our body fat stores, which produce a hormone called leptin. That's the primary thing that is involved in this regulation. And the more body fat stores you have, the more leptin that's in your circulation that feeds back into the system in the brain, which is designed to sense, okay, do I have lots of energy in storage on my body, or do I have very little? Do we need to, if I have very little, then I need to go out and seek out food and find food to store more energy in my body fat stores to make sure I have it available in case I've got to go without food for a period of time. And if I do have lots of leptin in circulation, indicating sufficient body fat stores, then I don't need to feel so motivated to go pursue more food, right? And that's how the system is designed to regulate. The problem is the modern environment and the modern diet, as Alex explained, of hyper-palatable food that has been literally engineered for us to find pleasurable, takes us out of what's called homeostatic eating, which is this body fat regulatory system operating correctly as it does in pretty much all animal species, where you eat food, you feel non-consciously motivated to eat an amount of food that is roughly in proportion to how much energy you're burning and in need of on a daily basis, on a weekly basis. You're consuming the amount that is essentially equivalent to how much you're burning off, and so your body weight and body fat levels stay stable over time. That's homeostatic eating in homeostasis with what your body actually needs. The modern environment and diet pulls us out of homeostatic eating into what's called hedonic eating more for pleasure. Because again, we have literally foods that are designed to be pleasurable by PhD food engineers. And it succeeds, especially over time, in overriding our body fat regulatory system and causing us to eat more and more hedonically and not homeostatically. And to the point where many people literally over years and decades quite literally forget. They're totally out of tune with the homeostatic signals. They don't even know how to regulate homeostatic eating anymore. I've seen people even who, when they're losing weight after a period of, they've become obese over several decades and then they're trying to lose weight. I've seen people who in that state, they start to feel a sensation in their belly, that their belly's burning, and they're questioning whether they should go to the hospital or not because they're afraid something's wrong. And then you have to explain to them, no, that's what hunger feels like. That's what actual physiological hunger feels like, not hedonic hunger, like I desire food because I'm excited to eat that because I know how good it tastes and how much pleasure it gives me. But homeostatic, like real physiological hunger is like, oh my gosh, my stomach's burning because I actually need fuel because I'm running so low on fuel stores. Like there are many people in our society who haven't felt that sensation in decades, maybe since they were a kid. So this is how the modern environment overrides this body fat set point system that's been designed into us and pulls us out of homeostatic eating. And the one last point that I want to make here is we have a paradigm of health, of medicine, that, as we've said, conceptualizes problems through a biochemistry lens. And it has the illusion of being scientifically sophisticated. Like if someone is presenting you a paradigm of insulin resistance and diabetes where they say, well, here's the biochemistry of the GLUT4 insulin receptor, and there's this mechanism and that mechanism and this biochemical and the AMPK and insulin levels are this, and hemoglobin A1C is this, and look at all your blood markers and look at this marker and that marker, and let's do gene testing to see which gene variants are associated with insulin resistance, and let's do microbiome testing to see which microbiome profile is associated with insulin resistance, and like genes and blah blah blah, and this biochemical and that biochemical, and it can seem enormously cutting edge and scientifically sophisticated. But if someone is presenting that paradigm to you, where they're presenting those things as the causes of insulin resistance, the causes, quote unquote, and they're not presenting what Alex just explained about all these things that are upstream of that with regards to the physical structural dysfunction, and then what are the root causes of that physical structural dysfunction, which are the modern diet and the modern way of life and the modern environment. And if they don't have that context of understanding those things as the root causes, it reminds me of the quote, if you can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with bullshit. Like you can present this way of understanding this problem that sounds to the uneducated person enormously scientifically sophisticated, but it's actually a bunch of BS if it isn't grounded in the context that you just presented.
Yeah. So, two things that I kind of wanted to add to that too, to drive this point home is this physical structure issue doesn't just apply to insulin resistance, but it applies to almost everything. And one simple example of that is If you think about cardiovascular problems and high blood pressure, most of those problems, a common recommendation is you need to start exercising. Exercise is great for lowering blood pressure. It reduces your cardiovascular risk. Um, why? Why does it do that? Exercise doesn't have those benefits because it's changing your biochemistry. It has those benefits because when you do aerobic training, your heart physically becomes stronger, your blood vessels physically become better able to dilate and contract as needed. Your cardiovascular system literally becomes physically stronger. It's not a biochemical issue. And I think for most things you can make that argument. Your liver,
As we do. And
yeah,
in the book we've been writing for the last year.
yeah, exactly. We're constantly exposed to toxicants in our environment, and they cause all sorts of problems. They cause the physical degeneration of many cells and tissues, and they're harmful. Well, how do you become better able at dealing with them? Well, you build up the physical structure, the physical capacity of your liver, so that your liver is better able to take in all of these toxicants from your blood, neutralize them, and get rid of them. And there's ways to do that. If you have strong organ systems, you're going to be healthy. That's fundamentally the truism of our existence. Um, People are so focused for their health and longevity on making sure that all of their biomarkers are perfect, which cool, but you're completely overlooking all of the macro level forces that ultimately determine most of those biochemical markers.
Yeah.
The
Well said.
second point I wanted to bring up,
Go ahead.
the second point I wanted to bring up too is that Ari and I are not saying that biochemical markers are not important. We're just saying that we don't think they should be the central focus, and they shouldn't be, the primary reason for decisions on what you should do to improve your health. If you have elevated LDL cholesterol, um, you could look at that and be like, well, I'm going to take a statin that's going to lower it. Directly addresses the biochemistry. Or you could figure out, why is it elevated? Is it related to your diet? What's going on with your liver that's preventing it from expressing LDL receptors that take up the LDL molecules? And you can, try and find a way that is more holistic, I would call it, instead of trying to short circuit systems in your body that are going to lead to adverse effects. Like in the case of statins, you have myopathies, and you have diabetes as another potential outcome. And then in some situations, biochemistry is actually, pretty important. One example I would use for that is the MTHFR mutation. Like, the reality is that this mutation, and I did a whole podcast years and years ago with Chris Masterjohn on this, but the MTHFR mutation, the whole reason that it actually spread and became so prevalent in the human population is because that the primary mutation works by reducing the binding affinity of that enzyme to riboflavin, which it needs to work. The human diet was so rich in riboflavin historically that this mutation didn't matter. It didn't impact our health. But now modern humans eating their, crappy modern human diet are in a position where this mutation does matter. And you can actually circumvent the issues with the MTHFR enzyme by simply supplementing more riboflavin to mimic what we would have naturally gotten in our diets way back when. Um, so, biochemistry can be helpful to figure out if you do have unique causes that, might be taking away from your longevity and your health span. Because there's always going to be those weird, like, little things that could pop up. But it's not the biggest needle mover. The biggest needle mover is your physical body and how much you're taking care of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. And with that in mind, again, looping back to this insulin resistance, this way of understanding it and understanding the upstream causes of it. Now, with that in mind, we can understand why the solution to this problem is not simply taking a drug or a natural chemical, to your point earlier, or injecting insulin. Because even if you normalize blood sugar measurements based on that, you have to a large extent not solved the fundamental problem, the fundamental root cause that is driving this metabolic dysfunction. Unless you have solved the structural problem that is present, you have not solved the problem. So how do you solve that structural problem?
So, ideally you would start eating a a whole foods based diet with low reward value. That would just make this whole process of eating less easier and let your natural homeostatic processes come into play. Um, but that, talking about that could probably be an entire podcast on its own. I and and because everyone's different, what I would say is basically just ditch as much of the processed crap that you can. And a ketogenic diet is really good for this because if you're not eating carbs, that eliminates pretty much all processed junk. Um, and
Except for all the ketogenic processed foods that have come to the market with the rise of the popularity of the keto diet. Like,
oh god, yeah, I
got to
know.
defeat that. The fat bombs and
Yeah,
all the keto processed food.
yeah. Fat bombs are not better than candy. Like just because they're full of fat. Um, just eating a whole foods diet, whatever that looks like, I'll leave it up to you. But fundamentally, you want to find a way to sustainably just start losing fat mass.
And
And
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Roy Taylor showed this really well, although he did it, rather extreme because in research studies, time's limited. But he showed over several studies now, both in people with obesity and most recently normal weight people with normal BMIs who had type 2 diabetes, that if you make them lose about 15% of their starting body weight, it will reverse diabetes to the point where they're on zero medications and they're now eating a weight maintenance diet that has carbohydrates in it, and the diabetes is gone. Their body is able to regulate that glucose again.
Yeah, this is the key point
And the reason
that I wanted to make sure that you emphasize to people that diabetes, like we've been searching for the biochemical cure, the pharmaceutical cure to diabetes, when there is actually a real cure for diabetes that has already been shown in research to essentially reverse full-blown diabetes, sometimes in a matter of a few weeks, by doing what?
Yep.
Correcting the physical structure. How do you do that?
Yes.
Through body
Exactly.
fat loss, through losing fat so that the fat cells can work properly because structure dictates function. If they're not constantly being inflated to their maximal capacity, like an inflated balloon that's about to pop, if you allow them to deflate and get rid of some of those stored fatty acids, now the physical structure of that adipose tissue organ can work correctly, and all of a sudden your metabolic health, your blood sugar starts to function properly again. Just literally, that some of these studies from Roy Taylor and others have shown that in 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 12 weeks, you can take people who have full-blown diabetes, who have been on medication for a decade or more, and completely make them non-diabetic through fat loss.
Yeah, and here's the one caveat to that. And this is important to mention is one of the things he found in his studies is among people who had diabetes for very long time, uh, some of them could not actually restore normal metabolic health after they lost fat mass. And the reason for that was because they had diabetes for so long that the physical structure of their pancreas deteriorated. And so now they were kind of in an intermediate state in between type 2 and type 1 diabetes. So even though the rest of their body was working fine, their pancreas is now no longer able to produce enough insulin to properly regulate blood glucose.
And the distinction being that this is
at this
at that point less a problem of fat cell dysfunction and more a problem of simply destruction of the pancreas.
Yes. And we don't currently have any cures for that. Although I will say there is some preliminary human and animal data suggesting that time restricted feeding and intermittent fasting allows pancreatic cell beta cells to regenerate. Um, I want to emphasize preliminary, but in my opinion, if you're somebody who has pancreatic damage from having diabetes for a long time, or, if you're somebody who has a genetic defect in their pancreatic beta cells to where you just from birth you had problems with your insulin secretion abilities, intermittent fasting and a lower carbohydrate diet are probably wise. Just because, until you're able to actually fix those structural defects of the pancreas, it doesn't really matter what else you do. You need to do something to make sure that you're not getting excess energy in your blood.
Yeah. Alex, this is the point in the discussion where after we've outlined this new paradigm, this new way of understanding insulin resistance and diabetes, we've presented it through this physical structural lens and how structure dictates function, and then talked about what's upstream of these structural problems. The solution, being predominantly body composition, now opens up 10 hours more of new discussion about how to optimize your body composition. And you've touched briefly on what is the single most important single strategy to lose fat, and for general health, which is to eat an unprocessed whole foods diet, and that is the number one strategy. But going beyond that, there's obviously, as I said, many hours of discussion of the nuances of optimizing body composition. I mean, just talking about muscle gain and muscle strength by itself is many hours of discussion. Just talking about fat loss, potentially many hours of discussion. And we know it's many hours of discussion because we literally created a course called the Fat Loss Blueprint that has many hours of discussion on fat loss, many hours of actual scientific lectures, taking people through the science of, understanding, first of all, what causes fat gain, how we get fat in the first place, and most importantly, how do we fix that problem? And presents a selection of advanced fat loss strategies that, as I said at the beginning of this, is essentially a compilation of everything that we know, the best of the best information and the most effective advanced fat loss strategies beyond the basics that everybody knows of, eat a whole foods diet and, do exercise. Okay, fine, I'm already doing that, but I still can't lose all the weight I want. This is for those people, okay? This is not a basic thing of, teaching you the basics that everybody already knows. Again, this is advanced fat loss strategies. And again, it's free of all the bullshit and all the gimmicks that you commonly see in the realm of fat loss online with all these charlatans and all of this pseudoscience and all of these gimmicky extreme diets and everybody trying to be the one diet guru who creates the latest, diet that goes viral, that everybody wants to jump on, that gets them on Dr. Oz and all the shows that they can talk about why their wacky diet is the one true ancestral diet and creates these magical fat loss effects. And there's this whole culture of pseudoscience and BS that exists in this realm. And I really want to distinguish what Alex and I have created as this is no BS, no gimmicks, no extreme diets, no hypey promises and all that kind of stuff. This is for people who are, quite frankly, intelligent enough to see through all of that BS and who actually want something that's evidence-based, that's rock solid, grounded in science. They want to learn the actual science of fat loss and be presented with a selection of advanced fat loss strategies that we know from the actual literature, and we're going to show you the studies to back it up. This stuff actually works to support not just rapid fat loss, but even more importantly than that, lasting, sustainable fat loss.
Yeah.
And be supportive of good health. Like, we need to not just lose, any monkey can lose fat rapidly. You just starve yourself. There's lots of ways of doing extreme diets that can cause 20 pounds of fat loss in 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks. But what we really care about is lasting, sustainable fat loss and changing our body fat set point, changing the set point that our body fat system, the set point system wants to regulate our new body fat set point at. So how do we work with our biology to do that? That's what this program is all about. For everybody listening, I hope you enjoyed this podcast with Alex. I would strongly encourage you to check out our Fat Loss Blueprint program. If you're watching this on YouTube, there'll be a link down below in the comments, or you can go to theenergyblueprint.com and click on programs and then click on the Fat Loss Blueprint. As I said, right now for the next 7 days, we're offering $200 off the normal price. So you can get it at $297 instead of $497. So with that said, if you're interested in losing fat, there is, in my opinion and in Alex's opinion, no better resource for losing fat sustainably and effectively than the Fat Loss Blueprint that we've created. I hope that you will check it out. And of course, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you're free to buy it, check it out, try it out for 30 days. If you're not blown away by the information, just email us and ask for a refund. No problem. If you say, "Hey, I already knew all this stuff. I've been reading about fat loss for 10 years. I knew all this information, and I didn't learn anything new here." There's, fine, cool. Well, we're happy to give you a refund. But I really doubt, unless you're a world-class expert in this field, I really, really doubt you're not going to learn a whole bunch of new stuff that is really going to blow your mind and, more importantly, change your body composition, help you lose fat sustainably for life, and help add years to your life and energy to your life. So I hope you'll check that out if you're looking to lose fat. Alex, thank you so much for coming on the show yet again.
Yes.
And to everybody listening, if you guys want Alex on again, we can do more of a deep dive on some of the advanced fat loss strategies. Maybe I'll have him on as a solo episode as well, where he can just kind of present information from studies. Who knows? We could do a live Q&A. There's a lot of different ways we could do this. But if you guys want to hear more from Alex, let me know down in the comments below or send us an email at support@theenergyblueprint.com. Alex, thank you again. And to everybody listening, I will see you again soon.